Okay, we're moving on here. Quick sponsor note to our friends over at Dev Squad. Basically, if you're looking for on-demand Laravel team to add, to your team on short notice or for a project, definitely check out Dev Squad. And thanks for sponsoring Dev Squad. Okay. Now we have Matt Stauffer, and he's also joined by Jose Soto. Let me pull them in.
Yo.
Hello, sir.
Howdy.
All right, 1 second here.
I have a timer. I'm ready to go with this.
That's good. Don't start it yet because it's not
Nope.
letting me. It's not letting me type, which is making this a little tricky. But we're gonna work it out. I have the technology to scroll. So hopefully that works.
The technology. We can do it.
All right. Let's see. Now can I find him? Because there's a heck of a lot of people in here.
Oh, that is a lot of
people.
Got him. That's a long scroll.
Okay, he's coming.
There we go.
I'm here.
All right, guys, take it away.
All right, let's do this. Hold on. There we go.
Start.
Timer's running. All right, so I'm going to get started on desktop 2, and then let's go. All right, so today we're talking about don't cry when your dev dependencies die. So we're talking about local development of your applications. And there's all sorts of tools we use every single day in our local development. We use some that are really visible, like our IDEs. We've got PHP Storm, we've got Vim, we've got Sublime Text, we've got VS Code, or our database management tools like SQL Pro or Table Plus. And we're super cognizant of which of those are we using and who's on what team and whatever. And some of them are a little bit less noticeable every day. Things like your OMyZSH or your OMyZSH shell or something like that, or the operating system that you use. And some feel almost invisible, things like which actual shell you're using, ZSH versus Bash, or maybe your local hosting environment. And so it's funny because those things that are the most invisible often have a bigger impact than the ones that we actually think about all the time. So today we're going to be talking about our local hosting environments, the local development environments in which we actually write our code on a day-to-day basis. So if you listen to the Laravel podcast episode where I had a couple folks on to talk about Docker and Valet and Homestead and all that kind of stuff, one of the things we talked about is the fact that there's different metrics that we consider when we're talking about which are the best. And a lot of these aren't universal. One person might care about one versus another, but also on one project versus another, you might care about one. And we're talking about ease of use versus ease of modification. How much resources do they use? How close are they to production? And so there's 3 kind of most common setups that you'll see in the Laravel world for people setting up their local development environments. You've got full Docker. So something like Vessel or Laradoc, where basically they create this kind of like a little network and all these tiny little Docker containers do all of these things all in Docker. So we've got our 3 categories here. I'm kind of characterizing these in as kind of like DNS, so sort of serving, redirecting from the URLs to a specific, one of your applications or something like that. You got Nginx configurations, DNS mask, or whatever. In the middle, we've got PHP and any other core dependencies that Laravel just needs to run. And at the bottom, we've got the sort of ancillary ones, MySQL or Microsoft SQL or Postgres or Redis or Memcached or whatever else. All those live in Docker. If you're doing Homestead or Vagrant, you have a single virtual machine. You got a single image there and it's got all those things running on all of them. It's not even individual containers, it's just one virtualized machine. And then in the Valet world, it's a little bit different. You install Valet and it comes with all the DNS ones packaged in the actual Valet app, but then Valet also takes the responsibility to manage Homebrew to install things like PHP for you. But Valet does not touch MySQL or Redis or Memcached. You're doing that on your own, and you're going to use Homebrew probably, but it's not Valet that's taking the responsibility for you. So what we're talking about today, most simply, is a 4th option. If you've heard Jose talk on Lyracasts or 20% Time podcast or anywhere else recently, you've probably already heard him talk about this. And we're going to kind of give an intro for those of you who haven't, and then move on. But you need the intro before you can understand what we're talking about today. So this one that Jose is going to give you the intro to in just a second is this idea that you're still using Valet for the things it does. Prepackaged Nginx, prepackaged DNS mask, and then manage your Homebrew for PHP and core dependencies. But instead, all those ancillary dependencies, you're not taking on the responsibility of running them through Homebrew. Instead, they're all being managed by Docker. So I'm going to hand it off to Jose to actually tell you how and why. So Jose is a very helpful human, like trademark TM. We'd like to call him Gaston around Titan, and he's a Docker enthusiast. So he's going to take over and kind of give you the high-level intro to what we're talking about here once I stop share.
All right. So if you happen to be working with lots of different applications, I think you'll find that a tool like Laravel Valet is helpful when it comes to serving your applications to the browser. But this is only one part of the entire stack of your application. Usually applications require other dependencies that Valet is just not built for, just like Matt was talking about. Things like MySQL or Redis or Elasticsearch. These are all ancillary services that your applications might require, but aren't really managed at all by Valet if that's within your workflow. So the easiest solution is to install these services locally, usually using a package manager like Homebrew or Chocolatey, sometimes even just going directly to the websites and downloading some sort of DMG or binary. But there's a problem. What happens when your local instance of MySQL begins to fail? You can't connect to it, or you can't find your data. There's just some issues that, it's giving you some crazy error message. So of course you're going to take that error message and you're going to toss it into your search engine, and it's going to just cost you really valuable time. You start searching Stack Overflow for solutions to your issues. There's outdated links. It's a big waste. So you'll probably begin to modify some obscure files in your system based off of these internet experts. You start to run these commands on your system. You have no idea what kind of side effects or lasting changes are going to be made to your system. Are you going to start adding files to your computer that you're not going to really know if you need to remove them later? And then in the worst case, you might be tempted to even just back up and reformat your machine altogether to get it back to some sort of clean state. And of course, that just takes a lot of time. You really you turn into a server admin for your local machine. And I don't know about you, but I am much more fulfilled spending my time and my client's time writing software than fighting with my computer. So I decided to try to find a better way to serve these extra dependencies without installing them locally. And in my research, I came across Docker. And I feel like once I finally wrapped my head around what Docker is and how it works, I found it to be the right tool for the job, for the solution that I was trying to solve. So the question is, how does Docker play into my local development environment? So let me take a step back here and just tell you, this is not an intro to Docker talk. There are tons of resources out there that do a great job of teaching Docker, and we'll share some of them after our talk. But I feel like in order for you to really appreciate what Matt and I are sharing today, a basic understanding of what Docker even is and what the architecture looks like is going to help. So Docker is a set of products that uses virtualization to deliver software in packages called containers. And these containers are isolated from other containers, but can communicate with each other, usually with some sort of like network protocol or port. The Docker provides parity between your local development machine and your production machine, since in both instances, the same engine is being used to run these containers. So I'd like to walk you through the architecture of a Dockerized Laravel application. And I think in doing so, you'll start to see better the evolution of my workflow and how I got to using Docker the way I use Docker today. So Docker containers run inside of a private network provided by the Docker engine. It's a separate network from the one on my host machine. So the first thing I did is I create a MySQL container, and Docker places that within this private network. If I don't expose any of the ports, it's completely isolated inside of that network. So then I add a PHP container, and this has the Laravel application I wrote bundled inside of it. So now this application needs to communicate with the database. So within our environment variables, we just tell it to connect to MySQL, usually port 3306 internally. So this is all within the private network. So next we want to actually host the application, serve it in a browser. And in order to do that, we install an Nginx container, and within our nginx.com file, we tell it to use PHP FPM from the PHP container. Once again, all within the private network. None of this is exposed to the public world just yet. But I want to be able to access this application from my computer's browser. I want to open up a browser, go to whatever domain name, and actually access this application. But in this current state, I can't do that. So I need to tell Nginx to expose port 80, usually the default port to host the application, and really just kind of pipe the data, add a pipe that I can access that Nginx application or Nginx port with. So at this point, I have a working Laravel application hosted in Docker and accessible on my host machine. I can open up a browser, I can hit that website and access this application as though I were going to publish it to the world. But now if I want to do some database management, I want to connect in, make sure that my migrations all ran, or that I have specific data in that database, there really isn't a way I can use something like Table Plus, a client like Table Plus or SQL Pro, to connect into this MySQL container, because the container itself is inside of this private network, which of course is different from my local machine. But then I thought, well, hang on, I'm exposing port 80 on Nginx. Couldn't I do the same thing with MySQL and access it that way? And so I tried that out, and yeah, it works. It's great. I was able to do that, connect into this MySQL container, view all of the data, and it was great. But this process kind of sparked an idea from my local development environment. I was thinking like, well, if I already host my applications with Laravel Valet on my machine, why couldn't I just use Docker to host my database? So just have one MySQL container running inside of Docker that I can access from my local port 3306 to the port 3306 inside of MySQL. And that's what I did. So this is what it looks like when I host all of my Valet applications, Valet hosted. I can access these locally with the domain .test, whatever. And each of those has in their .env file, acting as though it were localhost port 3306, has access to this database. And so in my mind, this all sounds great theoretically, but I think until you see it in practice, it might not be super attractive. So I'd like to just quickly demo how easy spinning up a MySQL container in Docker can be. So the first command I'm going to run here is just it's called Docker PS. It's showing all the Docker containers that I have running on my system. And -A is for all. This will show even stopped containers. So right now it shows all of these columns. And of course, there's nothing there because I have no containers running at the moment. So I'm going to bring up a MySQL 5.7 container, a MySQL 8 container, and I'm going to show you how I can connect to them using Table Plus. So here's the name I'm going to give it, MySQL. All right, and let me just walk through this command real quick. I know it's a pretty hefty command. So it's Docker run, and I give it a name of MySQL. MySQL is a unique name to my containers. I can't have two containers with the same name. So this is a really nice anchor point to send commands to this particular container. And now I tell it to use a volume. Volumes are kind of, you can think of volumes as like a virtual hard drive that you have that you connect into a container. And the nice thing about using a volume is you can connect it into a container, boot up the container, bring it down, delete the container, and you're still going to have that volume available on your system to use if you want, to bring up a similar container in the future. In this case, if I don't have this volume already created, which I don't on my machine, this command will actually create the container for me and then use that as a mounting point into this location inside of the container that I'm bringing up. Next, I give it a MySQL password in the environment variable. Open up port 3306. So this first number, this first 3306 is actually I'm gonna make this 3307 because this is what I have it set right now. So I'm gonna say my local port 3307 is gonna connect to port 3306 inside of this MySQL container. The -D is a daemon flag. It runs in the background. It's not gonna take up my terminal. And then I give it the image name and the version number. Again, this is not a Docker talk. You're not meant to memorize this or use this. You can if you want, but this is what I've been using to run my MySQL containers. Great. So now I'm going to do the same thing for MySQL version 8. I'm just going to call it 2. Same idea, gave it a volume. It's going to mount it in that directory. Root password is password, and then I'm going to change this to 3306. So now my port 3306 is going to connect to port 3306 in my MySQL 8 container. All right, let's check to see if they're running. And there they are. I have a Docker PSA command that only shows some certain columns. So if you see me running DPA, it's what it is. It's just a filter of the column names. Great, so I have these containers running, and we can see here my local host port 3306 is connecting to 3306 inside of the MySQL 8 container, and the same for 3307 on the MySQL 5.7 container. Now, what does this look like when we connect using Table Plus? All right, so we'll start with 5.7. Let me show you what the connection actually looks like in here. So we have it set to 5.x. The host is 127.0.0.1, which is our local host, port 3307, like we had it set in that command. Root is the root, and password is password. So if I test this, it should be working. I can connect to it. And if I make this full screen, you can see up top here, we're connected to a MySQL 5.7 server. So now I'm going to create a new workspace, connect to MySQL 8. Again, let's look at this configuration. Localhost 3306, root, password. It's looking like it's working. Let's connect to it. And you can see right here up top, MySQL 8. So right now on my machine, I have two different versions of MySQL running, 5.7 and 8. Running at the exact same time, just using different ports so that we don't have any conflicts. And all of the data that's being saved into those databases is being stored on a local volume on my machine, something that's not going to go away when I just bring down my containers. So let me go ahead and bring down these containers. So I'm going to say Docker stop. And we use the names that I gave them to send this command to those containers. This is going to stop these containers, bring them down. So if I run Docker PSA again, let's do the shortcut. So we have these containers here, but if we look at the longer version of this command, we'll see that their status has exited. So that means that these containers are still on my machine, but they haven't been removed from it. So now I'm going to do a Docker RM. Now I have no containers on my machine. However, if I do Docker volume ls, these are all the volumes that I have on my machine right now. And of course, the two that are MySQL data volumes are the ones that I had just created running that command. So any data that I had stored in those databases, it's good to go. It's not removed. So this is kind of my workflow. It's been my workflow for quite a while. Anytime I want to bring up any ancillary service, Melee search, memcached, I can just bring it up in a Docker container and have access to the service itself and not worry about losing any of the data because I'm using Docker volumes. Oh, hang on a second. Didn't mean to stop sharing. So why use Docker? Why use Docker to host these application dependencies? Well, first of all, it keeps my machine nice and clean. I don't have to worry about installing services, installing binaries on my machine, modifying configuration files on my machine. It's all containerized within these containers, completely separate from my machine. Also, things like multiple versions. If you ever try running MySQL version 5.7 and MySQL 8 at the same time on your machine, you're going to have a really bad time. And also some software is just difficult to install. Some of them require a lot of steps to get set up properly, which those steps are kind of wrapped up inside of your container. Some software is just impossible to install. If you think about something like MySQL or a Microsoft SQL Server, you can't install that on, via Homebrew. You can't install that on a Mac at all, but you can get it running in a Docker container. So it's things like that that I really feel that using Docker as a workflow in your local development environment brings a lot of benefit. And with that, I'm going to send it back to you, Matt. Let me stop sharing real quick.
All right.
If I can. There we
There you
go.
go. All right. Y'all seeing my slides again? It was being weird for there for a second. Okay, good. All right. So I tend to be the old man at Titan. There's some other old men at Titan, but I'm one of them. And what I mean by that is if you try to tell me I should do something new, I say, tell me why. You know, like new things are great when they have something to offer, but if the old thing works, then, you know, why change it? So Docker was one of those things for me. And I had two people who I trust and respect a whole ton, Chris Fidao and Jose Soto, both sitting here telling me, you got to use Docker, you got to use Docker. And I just said, why? What's this pitch? You know, what's it actually going to offer me? It's all this new complexity for what gain? Until one day, my MySQL tanked. In the middle of a normal workday, I was working on applications, I had a client deadline, all that kind of stuff, and it wouldn't work. And I am the you know, official-ish maintainer of Valet. So I spent a lot of time in the command line. I built multiple command line tools, and I just couldn't get it working. I was Googling and Stack Overflowing and modifying files, all the stuff that Jose talked about earlier. I was in the middle of doing this. And I just have to say that while Valet saves us for dependencies, and we have been working really hard to make sure that Valet is really good for helping you fix your problems, and like Chris is super awesome in the Valet issues. If it's anything Valet doesn't manage, you're out of luck. You're on your own. You're a server admin for your own machine. And that's not really how I want to spend my time. And Valet is not going to save you when you're in homebrew hell. And I literally shared this with one of my friends a couple of days ago, and he said, "Ooh, sweet, I got into homebrew hell the other day when I was telling him about what we're going to be talking about today." If you didn't get a chance to listen to the Laravel podcast that was about servers and stuff like that, you might have missed this really important idea in DevOps that Joe Ferguson shared with us about the idea of thinking about your servers as pets versus cattle. So the idea of your server as a pet is if something happens to your pet and it gets sick, you take the money and the time and the care to nurse it back to health. You don't want it to be sick. You want everything to be fine. Whereas if one of your cattle gets sick, you just kind of take it out back and throw another cattle up in its place. You got cow 1, cow 2, cow 3, cow 4 versus pumpkin or whatever, you know, or marshmallow. And my SQL server was a pet. It was my baby that I had to try and nurse back to health, and it was not doing the job, and it reminded me of this. So Jose saved the day. He said, this is the time to try Docker. And I was like, hey, you know what? If it's going to solve this problem, I've wasted hours of my day. Just do it. He's like, go download Docker and then just run this. And I'm like, this little thing, he's like, just trust me. So I ran this little thing and I opened up Table Plus and it literally just worked. And I was just like, that is ridiculous. I thought Docker was this whole hyper overly complicated thing. And he's like, there's different ways to use Docker. So that's awesome. But the downside is that not everybody has a Jose. And I was listening to him in the 20% Time podcast describing this way of working a couple weeks or months after he'd helped me. I was thinking, oh, that was so helpful for me, but I wish it were easier for other people. And I was listening to a 20% Tom podcast, and I just said, I want more people to get the value that I've gotten. Because since then, I also needed Microsoft SQL and Postgres, and he helped me get them set up. And Microsoft SQL, like he said, it's basically impossible. And I was able to get working with a client who's on Microsoft-based servers, and we got the Docker image spun up really easy. So when I went to the people at Titan and I started saying like, man, I really want us to find a way to kind of share this love with everybody. Keith actually said, we can call it Laravel Jose, which I thought about for a minute. So I was thinking about what does it look like for us to make this wonderful way of working available to everybody else? Because we can tell you you should work this way, but you can't actually do it until you have this repository, right? So I was like, oh, maybe we'll make a website and it'll be like, Jose search, and you type in MySQL and it gives you the thing, or type whatever. But it was missing a lot of the pieces about, well, how do I know if it's up to date? Because I'd have to be like, Jose, how do I tell which one's working? Why is this one not doing what I'm thinking? So it needs some other tools other than just that initial run command. So the next idea I had was, wait a minute, I love CLI-based tools and Lambo and all these different things that I worked on. Why don't we make a Laravel zero-based tool that is a Docker dependency manager for Laravel devs? And I talked to Jose because at first he didn't quite get it. And I was like, Jose, imagine you were doing your workflow and you didn't have the knowledge and repository you had. And he's like, I get it. So here's what we're doing. Everyone gets a Jose, but it's bundled in a free package that you all can install off of Composer once we make it public everywhere later. So it's going to be called Takeout. So this talk right here is a talk introducing an open source project. And I'm always a little wary about those. I've never done one before. I try to focus on talks that teach rather than talks that promote. However, we're promoting a tool only because of the fact that I want you all to learn this way of working. Jose wants you to learn this way of working. I was reticent and I didn't believe at the beginning, just like with Adam Wathan, and when he went into utility-based CSS, everyone's talking about that. Listen to the first episode of the Full Stack Radio podcast. I basically told him why I thought it was a terrible idea. And now I'm like its biggest proponent, right? Jose was trying to get me in the Docker train. I wasn't there. He converted me. Now I want everybody else to get there. But you need a Jose. So Takeout is really just a convenient tool to make you all also be able to benefit from this thing. So that's kind of why we're actually doing a product release here. So it's a Mac OS tool for installing and managing development environment dependencies using Docker. So it's a Mac OS only for now. We're hoping to get Linux and Windows set up and a GUI as well. But right now we just had to start with what we knew and start with Valet, right? It is meant to pair well with Valet, okay? So Takeout and Valet is a perfect pair. You can use it in other places, but that's kind of like our primary target audience. And as Valet is to PHP and Nginx and stuff like that, Takeout is to MySQL, Redis, Memcache, Postgres, Elasticsearch, whatever else. What it isn't is complicated or competition to Vessel, Laradoc, Homestead, Valet, or anything like that. So I'm going to give you a really quick rudimentary demo of just some of the simplest pieces. We've got lots of other plans. Jose will show you a little bit, but because we don't have much time, we wanted you all to understand why it's valuable. It's like, you know, the healthy don't know they need a sick only or the doctor only a sick do. It's kind of that idea. You needed to know the value before this tool is even exciting. So we only have a little bit of time to talk about the tool. So really quickly, let's set the stage for the situation we're in. So I have an app called Laravel Postgres app right here, and it's working fine because it's on MySQL. We're going to come over here and we're going to change our .env variables. And now it's on Postgres. So it's the Postgres type connection type, the Postgres port, Postgres username and password. And then I'm going to modify this root view to instead actually pull some real data out of the database. So the moment we do this, we can see an error. And this error says, I can't even connect to Postgres. So that's kind of the situation we find ourselves in before we walk over to Takeout. So historically, what you do is go download the Postgres app, and now you have this Postgres app running all the time because you don't really necessarily always install Postgres via Homebrew. It's kind of weird. Let's not worry about that right now. You're going to install Docker. You're going to install Takeout. You're going to use Takeout. Then you're going to profit. So you go to the Docker website. You just hit download. You download and install it. Once we have this live, which will be very shortly after this talk, you run composer global require titanco/takeout. And now you have this global command called takeout. And you've got things like takeout enable and takeout disable for all these various services we're working with. So we're going to go over here and we are going to say takeout enable Postgres. Okay. So we do that. And it's just always going to ask you for somewhere around 3 or 4 prompts. The defaults are always very good. So you can just use the defaults until you know what you're doing. And again, if we have a GUI later, which I hope to do, maybe Marcel's Electron course will get us there, it'll give you even more context and everything like that. So I'm just going to use the default. 5432 is the default Postgres port. Latest just means give me whatever the latest version is, but I could type a different version. Docker volume name, this is what Jose was talking about. We're basically attaching it to a persistent volume, or persistent storage, even when we spin it up and down. And then what's the password going to be? I'll let it be password. Instantly, I've got that running. So when we go over here, we're now going to see a different error. It's going to say that database doesn't exist. So we open up Table Plus, just like Jose showed you. I've got 127.0.0.1, I've got 5432, and then user Postgres password. We connect into it, and we've got a brand new Postgres instance with nothing in there. So I'm just going to create Laravel Postgres app database, and then we should get a different error. Something like the user's table doesn't exist. There you go, right? So then we can just do artisan migrate fresh seed or MFS. And then we come in here and it's fully functioning. So we have our data being pulled from our Laravel app from a Table Plus managed Postgres instance that we had up and running via Takeout with almost no time at all. So other things we can do really quickly when we're dealing with Takeout. We can do takeout list, and just like that PS-A thing that he was showing us before, it's going to show us, well, it's going to show us kind of poorly. There you go. It's going to show us our container information, and you can see that we're kind of doing, instead of just naming it something like Postgres, we're namespacing them all with a takeout prefix, and we're also showing you the versions so that when you have multiple versions, you know, it can be easier, and you can see all that port forwarding stuff. And then later, if I don't want to be using it anymore, I can do takeout disable. I can either hit enter and it'll show me all the things that are running, or I can say disable Postgres, and it'll take it offline. And if I take it offline and I try to connect to it a second later, we'll notice that there's no access to it. But because of what Jose was saying with those persistent volumes, that data is still there. So I can just spin that same thing up a little bit later and it will be just fine. It also notes that if it's your last container running, you might not want the RAM usage of Docker. And so we've got a little thing here that just lets you say, yes, turn off Docker for Mac. I'm not going to do that right now. And so we were to come back here, it's now going to throw that same error. It can't even connect to it. So that's like the really simple version of what Takeout does. You can enable services, you can disable services, and you can list all the servers that are running. So I'm going to throw Jose over just to do one real quick advanced features. There's way more that we don't have time for because I'm trying to talk slowly. And then I'll just going to give you some next steps. Mike, Jose, your mic's off.
Thank you. All right. So what I want to do real quick is show you the same workflow that I did in my first portion of this talk using takeout. So I'm going to bring up MySQL 5.7, MySQL 8. I'm even going to bring up Melee Search just to show you what the interface looks like having these containers running. So if I do takeout list, I have nothing running right now. I'm going to do takeout enable. I say MySQL port 3306. This is going to be, let's just give it a tag of 8, and then MySQL 8 password is going to be password. So these were all prompts walking through each of those flags that we talked about in that in that long list command. These are all prompts that are answering each of those questions. So now I'm going to do the same thing for MySQL 5.7. Port 3307, version 5.7. Password's password. And now I'm going to enable one more service. Using all the defaults. So now if I list this out, you'll see I have these 3 containers in here. If I do my Docker volume ls command, here are all the volumes that those commands created. And I'm going to connect to the MySQL containers using takeout or using a table plus. I haven't modified these connections at all. I just double click, it's connected. I'm using MySQL 5.7. Double click, now I'm connected into MySQL 8. So these are the exact same containers that I had running in the first portion of my talk. I was able to do it with just a couple of commands in using takeout. So now I want to remove these containers. So I'm going to do takeout disable. Takeout disable will show you all of the takeout enabled containers that you can disable. You can see there's 3 here, Melee Search, and then the 2 MySQL containers. I'm going to exit out without closing any of these. I'm going to run disable MySQL. When you run this, it only shows you the MySQL containers that you have running. If I only had 1 MySQL container, it would have gone ahead and just disabled it, brought it down. But since I have 2, it lets you pick the one that you want to disable. I'm going to go ahead and disable that one. And when I do that, it gives me a command here to remove the volume that was attached to that container. It says, hey, this is the volume that you had attached. If you want to keep it, fine. You don't have to make any other commands. But if you want to go ahead and remove that, you can do that. So I am going to remove that just like that. And the volume is no longer on my system. Oh, Docker, takeout, disable. If I run takeout, disable MySQL again, it's just going to go ahead and remove that. And give you the command to remove the volume as well. So that's essentially it. That's a nice little walkthrough of using that same workflow that I had before, just using takeout.
Beautiful. All right, one last slide, and I'm gonna let you all out of here. Well, out of our talk at least. So things we want from you. Number 1, try it out. Again, within a couple of minutes, you're going to be able to go to github.com/titanco/takeout, and you're going to be able to check it out there. Let us know what you think. One of the nice things about Docker is this doesn't leave detritus hanging around. You're not making any permanent modifications like using something homebrew, and now your configurations change forever. You try it out and you don't like it in a week or a year, you just delete Docker, it's gone, you're good to go. Share your thoughts, go to the issues there and give us suggestions and ideas. Contribute if you can. We've got tons of issues locked up in the project board, especially ideas for Linux, Windows, and GUIs and stuff like that. Go check it out there. And then YouTube's, or Jose's YouTube at youtube.josecanhelp.com has tons of stuff teaching more about Docker and how to work with this particular way of Docker. So thank you all so much for hanging out, and yeah, I hope you enjoy it.
Cheers.
All right. Thank you guys. Great job. It's our first team talk, I believe, as well. So another first today at Laracon Online. Great job.